Hello and welcome to the Potential Psychology Podcast. I'm your host, Ellen Jackson, and it's my mission to share the science of human behaviour in a practical, fun and inspiring way. My guest today is Tom Loncar, who is an experienced coach and mentor. He holds an MBA from the Australian Graduate School of Management and a Master of Science in Psychology and Neuroscience of Mental Health, which is an intriguing topic, from King's College in London. He has more than 25 years of leadership experience across the corporate sector, the public sector, and small to medium enterprises. And Tom is also a contributing writer on leadership to leading business magazines, which have included things like the Australian Financial Review, Boss Magazine, Switched On Leadership, Career Panorama, and recently The Psychologist, which is the British Psychology Society's professional magazine. And for this publication, he wrote an article called A Decade of Power Posing, Where Do We Stand? And I read this article and I was intrigued and thought, what a wonderful thing to talk about on the show with Tom, because for long-time listeners, you might remember that Melanie Schilling and I talked a little about power posing way back in our first season over 3 years ago. It might be one to look up if you're interested. And it's been a fascinating topic in psychology. So we're going to get a little nerdy with this one, if you're ready. And I'd like to welcome Tom to the show.
Hello, Ellen, and thank you for inviting me. Great to be here.
It is, and it's great to have you here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I suppose we need to start with, well, actually, I'm going to throw you off guard a little here because I'm going to start. What got you interested in power posing? Before we even talk about what it is, what led you to write this particular article for the British Psychological Society's magazine?
Well, I've been aware of power posing over the years. Working as an executive coach, you can't really avoid it. It's very popular, and you hear of people going to offsites or leadership development programs, and the TED Talk by Amy Cuddy often being quite prominent. So very inquisitive over the years, and I was kind of aware at a surface level that it was a powerful idea, but that had some controversy in more recent years. And in my sort of follow-up of the more general publications, my sort of inference was that Amy Cuddy, one of its key proponents, had refuted all of the questions, batted them away that had come up in more recent years. But then, in my more recent academic studies, a topic in the dissertation was to look at controversies in our area of interest, and I was looking at interventions for in the sort of the self-confidence domain for leadership. And in looking at controversies in this broader theme, I thought I'd dig beneath the surface of power posing, and suddenly all these various rabbit holes opened up that I wasn't aware of in my sort of more general knowledge beforehand. And that's where I started digging in, and that's what formed the basis of this article that you've described. 10 years of different rabbit holes.
Yeah, it is 10 years of different rabbit holes. And we'll go into some of those controversies in a moment for our listeners so that they can get a feel for just why this played a part, particularly in psychology and psychological research more broadly. But I guess we better start with a definition of power posing. What is it exactly that we're talking about?
Okay, at its essence, it's taking up an expansive posture, either sitting down or standing up, for up to 2 minutes, as a sort of a preparatory kind of thing before social evaluation takes place. So before a job interview or a stressful meeting. That's how the original authors portrayed it. But in terms of the pose itself, the two key dimensions to think of are expansiveness and openness. So expansion in terms of how much space you take up. So if it's standing up, a wider stance, and in terms of openness, it's like limbs, arms and legs open, not crossed or contracted is the general gist. So 2 minutes of that should be enough to help you on a few variables of interest. And in the original article, There were 3 outcomes. So the outcomes they looked at were the psychological benefits, so whether you felt more powerful and in control. Secondly, there was a biological measure, well, there were 2 of them, hormonal ones of testosterone and cortisol. It was found that they both improved in the right way. So testosterone, the hormone associated with victory, went up following a power pose, and cortisol, the stress hormone, went down. And also behaviorally, they set up a behavioral task to see how willing you were to take on adaptive levels of risk. So they did this through a gambling type of paradigm, and they found that people who did the expansive posture were more likely to take on this good level of risk. So 3 positive outcomes, all very relevant for when you're putting yourself out there in terms of a thing like a job interview.
And I think for many women, and maybe men as well, but I think many women, we relate to this idea of the Wonder Woman pose. So there she is, standing there, firm stance, hands on hips, shoulders back, really,
Exactly.
looking like she's ready to take on the world or solve the problems of the world, which I guess is what she was there to do.
Yes.
And so you're saying that then the idea was they had these people pose in these stances for 2 minutes and then have an assessment, or did, the study was basically assessing those psychological, behavioural and physiological effects.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And when was this original research done, Tom?
It was in 2010, and the paper came out in the Psychological Science journal. And I should stress too, it was 2 1-minute poses in the assigned conditions. Okay. So those who went to the expansive move did 1 standing up, 1 sitting down, as far as I can infer, and those in the contractive condition did 2 in the contractive poses. But 2010, 3 up-and-coming researchers from Columbia and Harvard universities, Dana Carney, Amy Cuddy, and Andy Yap. And it came out, and those biological and behavioural outcomes were the ones that were particularly exciting for that audience.
And so why did we pay attention to this? Why was this a thing when there are so many psychological studies published year in and year out? Why did this one gain particular attention?
Right. Well, it had its big breakthrough in 2012 when Amy Cuddy branched off from her 2 collaborators with that famous TED Talk, which is now up to over 60 million views, which is quite incredible. And it was ranked second for a long time, although I just checked a couple of weeks ago. It looks like it's just slipped down to 3rd in terms of the overall rankings. But it was quite a breakthrough. It's such an impressive narrative provided by Amy Cuddy in terms of where the research had come from, the examples she used, but also her personal example of being a very promising academic student, and then coming back from a conference with a couple of fellow students. She had a car crash and had some very severe traumatic head injury, which significantly lowered her IQ. So she really had to relearn everything with postural awareness, part of what of her journey back to the academic success that she became, teaching at Harvard. But that TED Talk, in combination with her book Presence, which came out a few years after that, really helped put power posing on the map. And it was probably around that time that I don't know specifically when I heard about it, but I'm sure it would have been through attention being drawn to that TED Talk, but also in the more general sort of management literature and also general media. Suddenly we saw power posing hacks being proposed for the workplace. Articles on LinkedIn. But in the UK, there was quite a bizarre interpretation of it at the 2015 Conservative Party conference, when suddenly Theresa May and her colleagues all started doing some quite strange-looking things with their legs, in particular, on stage, with investigative journalism. They're suggesting that it was uh, a weird interpretation of power posing, and I don't think they ever came out and refuted that. So, but it's well worth the Google. Conservative Party power poses.
We will we'll make sure we put a link to that in the show notes so that people can check it out, along, of course, with the link to Amy Cuddy's TED Talk. So it sounds to me, and certainly listening, and as somebody who works in the leadership and workplace space myself, and I guess it's not just that domain. As human beings, we're always looking for a kind of an easy fix, a quick fix, the silver bullet that helps us to overcome whatever challenge it is we're facing. And so I'm guessing that the idea of just being able to stand in a certain pose, that's a pretty easy thing to do, to be able to stand in a certain pose for a minute or two, and then for that to potentially, or certainly being sold as, allowing us to overcome our nerves, anxieties, perform better, present better, really achieve, therefore, a number of our goals, whether that is, as you say, getting a job, or being able to nail a presentation, or being able to be, perceived as somebody who is capable and confident and is on top of it all. The silver bullet, I'm guessing, was part of that little marriage of different circumstances that allowed this to really take hold in the public mind.
Yes, absolutely, and the one of the closing themes in that TED Talk is how this is a powerful tool for the powerless, and to spread the word on that front. So and a lot of enthusiasm there for it. But you're right. Some problems inevitably emerged when it was seen as a one-size-fits-all panacea for the powerless suddenly becoming powerful. It ain't so simple. No,
it never is it, with the human beings? So we'll come back to that. But I'm interested, Tom, because this is all, well, I'm going to say relatively recent. 2010 is not that long ago in the whole great scheme of things. The idea of embodiment, this idea that how we physically present ourselves and how that might have an impact on how we feel, that's not that new, is it? That's an idea that's been around for a little while. Could you tell us a little about the history of embodiment as you understand it?
Yes, absolutely. And embodiment, the term tends to be used interchangeably with embodied cognition in social psychology. But the word embodiment's got a lot of different meanings across different contexts, and in looking into it, and it kind of relates kind of to the same thing. But if you were to ask a neuroscientist or a philosopher to define it, they'd be probably a bit more complex in their definition than a social psychologist. But in social psychology, it tends to relate to the idea that our bodies influence our emotions, and remembering that's a bidirectional thing. So often we think that an emotion could be fear, leads to contraction or some sort of bodily expression, but in embodied cognition and embodiment, it brings to light the bidirectional nature. So with power posing, it was like the posture leads to the emotion of feeling powerful and in control. But that idea does stretch back in terms of the lineage in social psychology. It tends to stretch back all the way to the work of William James, the philosopher from the 1890s, who in his time, it was also a controversial idea, but William James was quite strident in his view that our bodies then influence the consequent expression of emotions. So there's some quite evocative quotes from him that do crop up in the literature from 2010 onwards that relate to power posing. And Dana Carney, Amy Cuddy, and Andy Yap in that original article do make a point of pointing out William James's ideas.
Yeah, and I find it's interesting. Just on reflection, I interviewed Dr. Diana Hill, who works in acceptance and compassion therapy and training, just recently for the show, and we were talking about the links. She also has a background in yoga training and teaching, and she actually got me to do a couple of little physical things where we were using the idea of embodiment, the way that we move our body and what impact that has then on our cognition, as you say, and our emotion, the three things being very tied together.
Yes.
And I know, and I expect this would be your experience as well as a coach, that I do use my reflection of somebody's body language, how they are appearing to me, both in terms of their stance, but also in terms of facial features and just what I, really I call their energy, which sounds very woo-woo, but what it is and how it is they're appearing to me as a real signal in terms of their engagement with their motivation or an idea, or perhaps a little sign for them of something that they might want to pursue further. Because often when you see somebody talking about something that really does engage, inspire, enlighten them, that is really matched well with their motivation and perhaps their strengths and interests, that they might have a little bit of a blind spot around. But when they're talking about it, you do see them light up. You do see their face change, their stance change, their shoulders back, they look up. So that's very non-scientific, entirely anecdotal, but it does feel from a number of different streams that there is clearly this link between our physiology and our both the emotions and our behavior.
Yes. And I did listen to that episode with Diana. It was very, very insightful. Great work there. And
it was fun to do too.
yes, and you make a good point too. Like the embodiment literature in social psychology, it's not just about posture. It's how we walk, and facial expressions. Modification of breathing, for example, all that has been used in studies looking at how it can link to emotions, and facial expressions in its own time is through the facial feedback literature and the famous pen in the mouth study by Fritz Strack from the 80s. That's been just as controversial as power posing in its time. And with I think replication still being talked about for that original 1988 experiment. But that was the idea, where if you have a pen or a pencil between your teeth, and thereby activate the facial smiling muscles, versus between your lips, more closely mimicking a frown. If you're exposed to some Gary Larson Far Side cartoons, if you're in the smile condition, you're more likely to have found those cartoons funnier. So it's preparing with a bit of a forced smile could work in your favor by feeling more joyful than if you.
Look, which takes me back to I'm guessing probably first year psychology many years ago, and the Duchenne smile. Those are original studies that were done a long time ago, where they'd show you, certainly as a student, they show you a series of faces, and we're supposed to be able to pick whether or not somebody has their genuine emotion, depending on whether or not it's a genuine smile, versus what they call this Duchenne smile, which is kind of the activation of the muscles around the mouth. So it looks like you're smiling, but they're not necessarily the eyes or all the other elements. I think that was one of the first times I remember learning about this idea that how we feel is reflected in how we look. So that's that one direction, that unidirection. But then obviously a lot more research since on how it works in reverse. So Tom, you've mentioned controversy around the power posing research a few times. Let's delve a little further into that. What exactly was the controversy around something that had obviously become a very high profile, for psychology particularly high profile piece of research?
Yes, well, it's the controversy really started in 2015, where a replication attempt by Eva Rainhill from the University of Zurich and her colleagues attempted to replicate the experiment, and they weren't successful on all of those outcomes. So that was 2015. And it's a little bit strange, or anyway, I'm curious as to why there wasn't controversy earlier, because these were quite big claims emerging. And digging into the nature of the experiment, it's quite a small sample. Like, there were only 42 participants. It was skewed towards females, and all of the respondents, or all of the participants, were Columbia University students. So quite a sort of a small and narrow population from which to begin the power posing movement. Yeah. So 2015, this first replication. So Eva Rainhill found that while the subjective psychological benefits of power posing, so feeling more powerful and in control, did replicate, they didn't have similar success on the biological or behavioral variables. And so with a couple of other replication attempts also not overly successful, power posing did unfortunately become embroiled in that broader replication crisis that was emerging for social psychology in 2015, where established domains of evidence, like research into social priming, for example, grit was also questioned, even growth mindset. A few replication questions emerging there, and so power posing, became embroiled within that.
And why is so we'll have a lot of listeners who are well versed in psychological research and background, but we'll have some who are not so much. Why is replication important, and why is it sometimes difficult?
Right. Well, psychology does purport to be a science, and if something is scientific, it should be. You'd think it should be repeatable. And once you have a bit of clarity there, find out if it's more repeatable in some contexts versus others, like across gender, personality factors, etc. So really, up until 2015, there was kind of a thing where psychological journals would only publish positive results. So if you had a hypothesis and it didn't work out, you might not be encouraged. No one's interested. Whereas, like, say, for argument's sake, say that you're looking at power posing and 99 experiments have failed. I'm not saying this was the case, but say that 99 had, and then that 100th one worked, and that's the one that's published. So it's kind of giving a misleading read on what the broader scientific effort has been finding. And so lots of evocative kinds of metaphors for what was going on around then. Andrew Gelman called it the situation as researchers being faced in a garden of forking paths. With so you make these little, ideally you'd think, if you're a scientist, there is the one true path to follow to get the result, but as it was, all these little tiny decisions that could be made along the way, in terms of maybe adjusting your dependent variable or adding in a new one, or deciding some results are outliers that you don't include in your main analysis but you include them. So all of these little tiny adjustments. It's also been called researcher degrees of freedom in terms of how you play around with it. And Dana Carney, the original lead author of the power posing article in 2016, she came out with her own reflections on some of the I guess you'd call them shortcuts or less than robust kind of decisions that had been made along the way for that original article. And that was to the extent that in 2016, she said that she did not believe that the power pose effects are real.
So complicated. I mean, it's fascinating as a bystander watching all of these events unfold and the continuation. This as you say, researchers starting to look, and researchers can be very particular about each other's work. There is a level of competitiveness, as I understand it, and we can, and perhaps sometimes their own or each other's worst enemies. So there's a little of that going on within the profession, and then within the scientific professions more broadly, especially around social sciences. Then there is this element of spotlighting, I suppose, people actually paying attention to some of these, because these have been really very popular ideas in, as you say, the leadership media, in general media, growth mindset you mentioned. I think there's been some work there around the willpower as well. A number of these different topics at the time, high profile researchers, high profile topics, and then this kind of underlying question around the research and how replicable, if that's the word, how reproducible some of these ideas are, and power posing seem to bear the brunt of a lot of that media spotlight.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm sure there's a lot of professional jealousy in there too. You know, if you happen to hit on the study that does touch a nerve in the general public, you know, your brand awareness is headed towards the stratosphere, as it did for Amy Cuddy.
Yeah, and interesting, because I think, well, certainly from my experience, this is a relatively recent phenomenon, certainly in the social sciences. You know, way back when, certainly when I was starting out, research just sat and didn't get nearly the media attention, the high profile. There were no TED Talks for researchers to be able to get up and really, you know, spruik their ideas and their discoveries. And as you say, for those who are particularly savvy, who are great with the narrative piece, for those who have had, I mean, obviously in Amy Cuddy's situation, it was a terribly difficult, traumatic experience that led to part of that narrative, but there's a little bit of art as well to being able to sell your stories with the story, or your research with the story, to have that kind of impact. And then the book deals that follow, and everything else. So a very interesting time for psychology.
Yes. And if you look at the underlying motivation, you know, these people want to help people, so it's a message that they're keen to share, and there's some exciting platforms now for it. But into the other sort of contextual factor, Ellen, that was emerging at the time too, was that, speaking of reproducibility, there was something called the Reproducibility Project, run by Brian Nosek from the University of Virginia, and I think his group was called the Center for Open Science or something like that. But they got 270 researchers together. It was all crowdfunded, aiming to reproduce 100 established psychological studies. And in terms of the success they had, it was 36%. So 36% of these studies that had been held in high regard, only that number were reproducible. And that study's report came out in the back half of 2015, which is just at the same time as that first replication fail for power posing. So.
Yes, I do remember that. Now that you said that, I forgot about it. But yes, and then there was a lot of media attention on that as well, and it started to call into question so much of the research that we'd relied upon and built upon as a field over time.
Yes, and beyond sort of more civilized academic kind of debate on the merits of, you know, something like power posing via journals, suddenly academics had access to blogs on which to base their critiques. And, you know, Andrew Gelman, who I mentioned before, in his stats modeling blog, has been quite vocal in this replication domain. So it was quite a change in academic discourse. And there's a really good article in the New York Times that I think it's called "When the Revolution Came" for Amy Cuddy, and the writer of that speaks to some of the, or one person in particular who was very critical of Amy Cuddy, and it was the gist was that they kind of didn't appreciate the downstream effects of the potential harm or the perception that it was could be validly be seen as a form of bullying of going for someone in this way.
Yeah, we forget sometimes that there are actual people behind a lot of these ideas and this work when we get caught up in the controversy that there's a life and a human being with feelings sitting behind all of that. So, Tom, where did we get to with power posing? It was a big thing and then it was a questionable thing. What happened next?
Right. Well, there's a couple of interesting chapters, but the first attempt to draw some kind of academic line under it was in 2017 in the journal Comprehensive Results in Social Psychology. And what they did was there were 7 pre-registered studies taking part in that, all looking to replicate power posing in as true a sense as possible. And Dana Carney herself reviewed all submissions to make sure that that everything was as aligned as possible with the original intent. And so 7 studies came in 2017, and then there were quite mixed results in the individual studies, but what they did was they aggregated the data in all of them where it was possible. And they did a kind of a meta-analysis on that within this journal article, in a separate article at the end. Over 1,000 participants grouped together, and what they found was, again, no, the biological and behavioural outcomes weren't replicated, but the feeling of power was. So that was now produced from a sample of over 1,000. So we'd moved from the teeny-weeny tiny studies to a big one. So they suggested that let's accept this, that something significant was observed as far as felt power was concerned, and now let's look at how this might break down across different audiences, and they mentioned across gender, across personality factors. For example, does it work better for extroverts versus introverts, etc. So that was a kind of a bit of a civilized kind of like, okay, we've got to here. Now let's build forth from here. And so that was in 2017. But then there's been a couple of really interesting developments in the last 2 years, Ellen. The first one was in 2019, where Marcus Crede from Iowa State University, he had quite a pithy observation of the studies to date in this area, in that he pointed out that most of the experiments had been set up as expansive versus contractive comparisons, which is good with participants randomized to either condition. But the fact is that we don't have or neglecting a neutral control. So so any positive results, we don't know if they're driven by a positive result of the expansive pose or the negative results of a contractive pose, because we don't have that neutral kind of baseline. And so very interestingly, the year after, Emma Elkjær from Aarhus University in Denmark and her colleagues, they actually did a huge systematic review and meta-analysis examining expansive bodily movements more generally, with power posing included. And they located more than 70 studies for their systematic review, of which about 48, I think, from memory, were submitted to a full meta-analysis. And that's where it gets interesting. So what they did was that they actually isolated 14 studies from their literature search, which did have a neutral control condition. Okay, so at the higher up from the hierarchy of scientific evidence. And what they found was that in those studies where a contractive versus neutral comparison was possible, contractive versus neutral produced, or actually directions, neutral versus contractive has a more positive result than expansive versus contractive comparisons, right?
Okay. Yep.
And that expansive versus neutral comparisons are not significant.
Okay,
Right.
so
Right.
it's not so much the Wonder Woman pose that's
Mm.
having an impact as the not being in those contracted, folded
Yeah.
in on yourself,
Yeah.
negative in inverted commas,
Yeah.
style pose.
Yes.
So there you go. So it's not really a Wonder Woman power pose at all. It's just a not the opposite.
Well, yeah. Well,
Is that what we're saying?
well, kind of from that, and that's from the well, I have stressed from the limited amount of studies to date.
Mm.
So there's a lot in the expansive versus contractive to date. That's where most of the effort's been focused. But from here, there's something going on in with neutral
We
versus
need more
contractive,
research.
and so future studies, let's like start orienting further up the hierarchy of scientific evidence and get those neutral controls in there. But at this stage, it's it's quite a powerful thing. So Grandma was right. Don't slouch. It's
No, I'm sitting up straight now.
yeah, which is
fascinating, and I mean, fascinating on a number of levels, not just around the power posing itself, but even just this as a good example of exploration around the scientific method. A topic that probably pre-COVID and global pandemics, not nearly so many of us were as well versed in as we are now, largely around, well, certainly epidemiology is a word that most of us couldn't even say, let alone knew what it was or what epidemiologists did. But clinical trials, control groups, so much more discussion around particularly the medical science. But to be able to then look at this as an example within the social sciences, within psychological science, to just explore the process, the fact that it is not a black and white, linear, this is definitive, it's decided, or so rarely is that the case, that it is always a case of what next, what can we learn next, a process of curiosity and inquiry that just leads us to kind of shape our ideas around something rather than coming up with a definitive response.
Yes. And another important finding or recommendation from that last meta-analysis is that context is important. So getting back to what we discussed about power posing being wrongly interpreted as a panacea across all stressful situations, but what they did found was that in this area that context is important. That they found that attempting an expansive bodily expression where the experiment had an element of failure, or an element of a negative experience for the participant, that the outcomes were quite stressful for the participants. So
what does that mean for us in practical terms? If we're thinking of using power posing, what are the risks perhaps therefore that this is suggesting might exist?
Yeah, well, the risk is that treating it as something that it will save you across all contexts. If you're about to experience a dressing down from your CEO, do you go there in with hands behind your head, and it's contextually wrong, and you might it might make your situation significantly worse. So be mindful to the context, and be prepared to be flexible. And Deborah Grunfeld from Stanford's got some great ideas in this area, and it's about when to play high versus when to play low in different social contexts. So she does mention power pose as an example of a non-verbal of playing high, but it's not something that will suit you across all situations, or even within the one situation where you might have to be flexible and attuned to the ups and downs of where the dialogue's going in, particularly when there's a few people involved with different roles, different levels of status, and what your goals are for that interaction.
Mm. So
Mm.
I guess what it's telling us, like
Mm.
everything to do with human behavior, it is complex. Context does make a
Yeah.
difference. And I'm wondering whether there's an element of, and we sort of bring this down to the practicalities of how might we use as individuals our physical presence to have an
Mm.
impact on a situation or on how we feel about a situation, which is one of
Yes.
those variables that they did find where it was
Yes.
linked.
Mm.
Then is there an element of just personal experimentation here, do you think? Is there a little bit of, I'm just going to try something new and see what happens?
Absolutely. Yes. And at its core, like the brilliant thing about all of this is that and even with the most recent meta-analysis, which kind of provided those numerous qualifications, but it does remind us that posture and our bodies are important, and anything that gets you out of your head and into your posture and how and that kind of you know in the moment kind of awareness is a powerful, useful thing. Because
Mm,
I'm sure
mm.
in your coaching world, working with with many busy people, they often can get stuck in their heads, and
We all
it's
get
such a
stuck in our heads.
right. And posture and physical awareness
Mm,
is an extra option, and
mm.
in financial terms, options have value. So if you do have
Yeah.
extra options for what you notice in yourself, others, and how you relate to them, it's a valuable thing.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. And it's got me
Mm.
thinking then about, I mean, we've had a number of conversations here on the podcast around mindfulness, around breath practice.
Yep.
So many of our different areas
Mm.
of work in human performance are
Mm.
kind of coming back a lot to these ideas of our physical selves, perhaps
Yeah.
more so than we used to talk about. And I know certainly having grown up and done my kind of management training
Yes.
in the 90s,
Yes.
none of this was on the radar then. We were
Absolutely.
all
Yes.
just in our heads and in financial analysis and spreadsheets and models and
Yes.
things.
Yes.
So many more of our conversations now are coming back to us as human beings and our
Yeah.
physicality being an element of
Yes.
that.
Mm.
Whether that is the way we breathe, whether it's eye contact, whether it is indeed posture, even for well-being. I do a lot of uh, promoting, I think, of the well-being walk, as I call it. So just
Ah.
actually getting out and taking a walk, both for your self-care and well-being, but also due to some interesting research that came out of Stanford, looking
Mm.
at creativity and problem solving and walking, or just
Right.
physical movement, for which they weren't fully, or
Mm.
I haven't looked at the research for a little while,
Mm.
but the underlying mechanisms weren't entirely clear, but there was certainly seemed to be a link between the act of walking
Mm.
and being able to problem solve in a way that's far more efficient than sitting at our desks and trying to problem solve in front of a computer, which is what we so often try to do.
Yes.
So
Yes.
advocating getting out there and going for a walk, which is just another element of our physical selves.
Yes.
So
Absolutely.
Tom, I'm interested to know what impact all of this immersing yourself in the
Mm.
research has had for you. Have you experimented with different postures and poses, or just even become more aware of your physical self in different situations and the link between that and how you feel?
Yes. Yes. It's yeah. Like I said, it's a great reminder about the importance of getting out of our heads um, like like a few of your other guests. I also am a strong have a strong interest in acceptance and commitment coaching,
Mm,
and this whole postural domain is often an easy gateway into I guess a proactive form of mindfulness, like
mm,
you in the complex context that you're in, which I use in my coaching with my clients. Um, but the other, that's the sort of the practical benefit, but also this study that I've been doing has just been a fantastic gateway into a real contentious scientific debate,
mm,
and getting to appreciate the changes that psychological science is now experiencing over the last 4 or 5 years since that, the replication crisis, as it was called. And a journal that well, I subscribe to the Psychological Science Journal, and all studies there now do, there's a little marker for 3 areas, like, is the data freely available to other researchers? Are all research materials available too for anyone wanting to exactly replicate the study? And also, is the study that we're looking at, is it pre-registered? So did the authors commit to the line of inquiry and all variables at the outset? So it's a markedly different field now.
And like any crisis, I mean, they did refer to it as the replication crisis within psychology, like it was a disaster, a looming disaster, or a disaster that we were experiencing at the time. And yet, I guess what that has led to, like many a crisis, is an opportunity for improvement. So those little indicators that you've given there around what is expected now from publications, that there is the opportunity, the data, the access that is required in order to replicate. So really what we've done, it wasn't a crisis after all, it was just a little opportunity, a point of disruption that provided us with a chance to improve practice and improve research processes, presumably for the betterment of the field overall.
Yes, indeed.
Tom, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Thank you for all of the work that you've done to be able to, and I did say to you off air prior to us starting our recorded conversation today, that for me, an appreciation of having this information, this quite complex conversation around not just the power posing, but the replication work and now the improvements, as we just mentioned, in a really succinct article that was easy to read. And I will link to that for all of our listeners who are perhaps interested in delving a little further, but to have it all in one space so often, and fellow practitioners in the field would appreciate this as well. It's so hard to get a succinct summary that is unbiased, as you said, presented without a particular point of view, just a summary of a situation, the research, and being able to put that all in one place in an easy to read manner is rare. And so I very much appreciate that. And it was that really launched this conversation where we've been able to delve into a little further. So I thank you very much for all of that work and for being here and for discussing it today with us.
Well, it's been a real pleasure, Ellen, and thank you so much. And keep up the great work with potential psychology.
Thank you very much. I will pop a link to lots of this. So there's lots of studies, lots of work, as well as Tom's article itself in the show notes for today's episode, along with, I believe you've also done an ABC radio interview recently as well on this topic. Yes. So I'll find the link to that and pop that in the show notes for our listeners as well if they're interested in following up with that.
Great. Thank you, Ellen.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks.